podium, is that David gave the first talk to Islington U3A. I think a friend of Anne's, and she obviously, if you know Anne, cajoled him into doing this. None of us really can avoid that when the pressure is on us. So here's David, who came and talked to us at that first anniversary. So it's great to have him back here today. I don't think David really needs an extensive introduction from me, because the size of the group shows that you all know about him. But I suppose he's currently, I would say, he hosts the BBC Radio 4 The Briefing Room, but of course he's worked for everybody, ITV, BBC, The Independent, you name it, he's written for them. He's that sort of person. So I want you all to give him a welcome to David.
I think that was my cue, wasn't it? I'm going to stand up, but it's going to make reading my notes quite difficult, because I imagine quite a lot of you, I never quite get the right focal length for anything these days. And it's always not absolute, and it may be that I can do it with a distance. And I'm too far away to use my reading glasses, so you're going to have to forgive me some kind of infelicities. And the most obvious thing to do is to congratulate you on this 10th anniversary, which is a really substantial achievement. I was a fair bit younger then, well, obviously 10 years ago, and I hadn't quite reached the age where I seriously thought, before I stand up to speak, that there might be a reasonable chance of me collapsing and dying during the middle of the talk. But who knows these days? I mean, you know, my next birthday is one of the big ones. I think you can probably guess which one. And I have to say, having got to the age I have, I'm actually, given that I'm relatively newly a grandfather for the first time, I'm amazed to see any of you here at all. I mean, I just say, I knew that my oldest daughter was pregnant, or was thinking of having a child, when she said to me, we went to go to the football together, she said to me, Dad, she said, me and Martin, her husband, we're thinking of moving in quite close to you. I said, all right. And I went back to Sarah, my wife, and I said, she's going to have a baby. And she said, how do you know? I said, because she said she's going to move close to us. And Sarah said, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. Sure enough, that's exactly what happened. So this morning, Sarah got up at 6, in order to go and collect the granddaughter and walk her down to the nursery, from where she will then collect her again at 4:30 this afternoon. And I can see quite a lot of noddings going on. I mean, let's face it, quite a lot of you are in the position now whereby you're just in between those two acts yourselves and so on. It is kind of one of the great unspoken things that I hadn't realised. I partially hadn't realised because my parents never expected to do any of it. And that's one of the things that has changed for our generation, I think. I'm going to talk loosely. So, the title of this talk, Oh What Happened to Me, Whatever Happened to You, which of course was the theme song from... Whatever Happened to the Likely Lads. It's sort of one of the great sitcoms in Britain. That's one of the things that's happened to you and it's happened to me. But I'm not going to really concentrate on what the kind of personal changes have been, because we can all kind of work those out. I could go around and say, how many of you had a knee operation last night? Thing is, actually getting any kind of operation these days is frankly rather difficult. We can come on to some of the problems that we've been having. I just did want to ask, though, I'm seeing the committee members who are here 10 years. Was anybody else here was it in the Union Chapel for that talk? You were there. Do any of you remember what I said? or am I free to lie about it?
There were a lot of people there.
there were a lot. There were. I guess there were a lot of people here, and it always kind of amazes me. It does amaze me. I thought, well, if they, well, I mean, you've come back, so it can't have been that bad. Either that, over 10 years, one memory fades. Anyway, so 10 years ago, but I could also call this talk fragments, because it is a very fragmentary address I'm going to give, or I couldn't call it harbingers, because part of what it's about is what we didn't know then that we know now, which is why I was asking whether anybody remembered whether I'd made any predictions in 2013. But the other thing you do when you kind of look up what happened 10 years ago is you realise that different parts of your memories are actually on completely different timescales. So, for example, the biggest grossing film of 2013 was Frozen, which I have a horrible feeling I'm going to be hearing in the course of that film and the movie and the song from it within the course of the next 2 years, and I cannot bear it. I couldn't bear it then, and I can't bear it now. But anyway, that's about happens. But that to me, that seems like yesterday almost, and that's 10 years ago. But to remind you of some of the other things, in January 2013, 10 years ago, that year, Barack Obama and Joe Biden were re-inaugurated in the White House. Do you remember who the Deputy Prime Minister was in 2013? Nick Clegg. Nick Clegg was Deputy Prime Minister, and the Business Secretary was Sir Vince Cable, Tom, because we were 3 years into the coalition government. Do you remember who the Pope was in 2013? This is a trick question, because actually in 2013 there were 2 popes. It was the year that Pope Benedict abdicated and that Pope Francis was elected. Liz Truss was Childcare Minister, and I found a little report from her. She'd spoken to the Daily Mail in which she criticised chaotic nurseries for failing to prepare children for school life. She was quoted saying the Tory minister said she'd seen too many chaotic settings where children are running around. And if there's one thing that Liz Truss cannot stand, it's a chaotic setting. But what she recommended, possibly for the last time, was that we adopt the French system of learning in nurseries. There is almost nothing on the record about what Rishi Sunak was doing in 2013, other than that he became a co-director of his wife's investment firm, Catamaran. He was at that time working for, which was owned also by his father-in-law, and he was also working for a hedge fund. And presumably also contemplating a life in politics and so on. But William Hague was still the Member of Parliament with a seat in Richmond, where he was going to stand. So whether or not he can tip the wink that that would become vacant, we don't know. But at that point, he is a banker. Incidentally, and this kind of reflects a prejudice on me, I do not regard bankers as business people. I'm afraid. I don't actually think they're in the same. I've seen too much about, particularly people, kind of hedge fund operators, etc., to know that they don't actually get affected by the same whims as the rest of us do, which may explain why, when he went into Parliament in 2015, Rishi Sunak was in favour of Brexit. But we'll come on to that in a moment. Meanwhile, this was also the year 10 years ago when Keir Starmer retired from being the Director of Public Prosecutions. And the week he left, he called for the introduction of mandatory reporting following the Jimmy Savile scandal and other scandals. And there was a Panorama programme almost exactly 10 years ago in which Starmer says, I think the time has come to change the law and close a gap that's been there for a very long time. I think there should be a mandatory reporting provision. So that's what the leader of the Labour Party was doing. That year, 2013, so I've just come back by the time I talk, I went on a cruise by a rather fabulous French company called Compagnie du Ponant. I don't know whether any of you have ever kind of taken one of their things. I got it free because I was writing about it. The piece never appeared for the reason should become clear. But it was started in Istanbul, went up the Black Sea coast to Bulgaria, then took in the Ukrainian port city of Odessa, and then took in the Ukrainian port city of Sevastopol, because that's what the situation was in 2013. By the next year, obviously, that cruise was no longer possible. In the world of celebrity, again, almost exactly 10 years ago now, Donald Trump, the former Apprentice presenter, was in Russia overseeing the Miss Universe contest. And he was interviewed by a reporter from MSNBC to ask whether he had a relationship with the Russian President Vladimir Putin, to which Trump said that Putin had done a very brilliant job. He said that Putin was better than Barack Obama. He's done an amazing job, he said. He's put himself really at the forefront of the world as a leader in a short period of time. At that stage, this is obviously a year and a half before Trump actually runs president in the primaries. At that stage, in the United States Supreme Court, there is a 5-4 conservative majority, but not a reliable one, and there is no challenge to the Roe v. Wade abortion rights at that stage. That's 2013. In August of 2013, a bit before we had our meeting, 1,500 people were killed in a chemical weapons attack in the town of Ghouta in Syria during the course of the Syrian civil war. I mention that because on August the 30th, remember this is the one Barack Obama had said there were red lines that must not be crossed and so on. We had a debate here in the British Parliament on August the 30th. The government had recommended military action against the Assad government. That motion was defeated in the British Parliament by 285 votes to 272, following the Labour Party's decision to vote against it. The original suggestion by Cameron that we should take action, which probably would then have led to Barack Obama taking action, but we don't know that for sure, was backed up by evidence from the United Nations weapons inspectors. But after the vote, David Cameron said it was clear Parliament did not want action and, quote, the government will act accordingly. Labour leader Ed Miliband said on Friday that the House of Commons had spoken for the people of Britain. And he said, people are deeply concerned about the chemical weapons attacks in Syria, but they want us to learn the lessons of Iraq. They don't want to rush to war. They want things done in the right way, working with the international community. He said there's a lesson that Britain must do what's in its national interest, even if that means doing something different to America. He also said that Mr. Cameron must, quote, find other ways to put pressure on Mr. Assad. On September the 14th, the Americans and the Russians both demure came to an agreement about the future of Syrian chemical weapons. By 2019, the Global Public Policy Institute study said that there had been 336 chemical weapons attacks, 98% of which have been committed by Assad's forces in Syria. Also in 2013, and this is where we come to what you might call straws in the wind, or lines you can trace back, things we never noticed at the time, never conceived of. 2013 was also the year when a Moldovan flagged cargo ship, the MV Rosas, made to port in Beirut, was carrying nearly 3,000 tons of ammonium nitrate. After inspection by Port State Control, it says here, the Rosas was deemed unseaworthy and forbidden to set sail. By an order of an urgent matters judge in Beirut, the cargo was brought ashore early in 2014 and placed in warehouse 12 at the port. In 2020, as you probably know, because it had been entirely neglected, it exploded with a matter which took out a good portion of downtown Beirut and a large number of people with it. This is what I mean by harbingers. Of course, none of us had ever heard of the MV Rosas, we had no idea, and so on, but anyway. On a very lighter note, the roundabout now also 10 years ago, the Defence Minister, Anna Soubry, was on the Andrew Marr show. And it's amazing when you look back, just how many things happened on the Andrew Marr show. I'm making a 6-part audio documentary about Labour's 8 years from the election of Jeremy Corbyn to now. And half of what we do in terms of archive comes out from the Andrew Marr show, by the way. It's really astonishing. But anyway, she was on the show alongside Rory Bremner, Peter Mandelson, and Business Secretary Vince Cable. And Rory Bremner did a small impression of Nigel Farage. And all of a sudden, the Defence Minister, Anna Soubry, who I'd known years ago in student politics days, said, "I always think Nigel Farage looks like somebody has put their finger up his bottom and he really rather likes it." To which Rory Bremner said, "Are you allowed to say that?" Andrew Marr said, "Too late." Peter Mandelson said, "No, actually rather too early." But anyway, it was a reminder of the days when, among some Tories at any rate, Nigel Farage was not a popular figure, unlike this party conference, where he was celebrated on the fringes of the Conservative Party conference. Apparently what had happened was, a month earlier, Soubry said on BBC Question Time that UKIP had published a leaflet in her constituency suggesting that 29 million people were coming to the UK from Romania and Bulgaria. And Soubry told Farage, "I do not like your tone, you don't talk facts, you talk prejudice, you scaremonger, you put fear in people's hearts." This is a leading Conservative to Nigel Farage. It's also the year 10 years ago when Boris Johnson, then Mayor of London, appears also on the Andrew Marr show, but this time Eddie Mair, I don't know if people recall Eddie Mair, one of, I think, the best broadcasters that the BBC had. And he was standing in for Andrew Marr. And the write-up goes, "After the opening exchanges, 'Good morning, how are you?' 'Very, very good, thank you.' Johnson went downhill at an alarming pace until, by the interview's close, admitting he had sandpapered quotes as a Times journalist," that's made them up, failing to deny he lied to the party leader at the time, Michael Howard, about an extramarital affair, and conceding that he had humoured an old friend when he asked for a phone number in the knowledge that the friend intended to beat up the owner of it, etc. By the interview's close, "You're a nasty piece of work, aren't you?" was one of Mayor's most generous reflections. Just a little reminder, he was Mayor of London. He'd run for Mayor of London re-election on the promise that he would not stand for Parliament during his term of office in 2015. As Mayor of London, he stood for Parliament during his term of office, and nobody much seemed to notice. In January 2013, 10 years ago, David Cameron made a speech about the EU. And this is a quote, and I'm going to quote a little bit from it, because, again, it just kind of takes you back. Because what this talk is really all about, in a way, is what we saw, what we missed, and therefore what we're seeing and what we might be missing. And this is what he said. This is kind of his peroration at the end of this speech. "I know there will be those who say the vision I have outlined will be impossible to achieve." It's a kind of vision of, Europe reformed in the way that he would like to see it reformed. "That there is no way our partners will cooperate, that the British people have set themselves on a path to inevitable exit, and that if we aren't comfortable being in the EU after 40 years, we never will be. But I refuse to take such a defeatist attitude, either for Britain or for Europe. Because with courage and conviction, I believe we can deliver a more flexible, adaptable and open European Union in which the interests and ambitions of all its members can be met. And when the referendum comes, because he just committed himself to it, let me say now that if we can negotiate such an arrangement, I will campaign for it with all my heart and soul, because I believe something very deeply, that Britain's national interest is best served in a flexible, adaptable and open European Union, and that such a European Union is best with Britain in it. Over the coming weeks, months and years, I will not rest until this debate is won, for the future of my country, for the success of the European Union, and for the prosperity of our peoples for generations to come." And that in 5 paragraphs is why you should never ever let a public school boy run your company. Because it's all there, the kind of overwhelming confidence, the idea that he can just achieve anything if he kind of puts his mind to it, and just take everybody with him. The force of his personality and argument will just do the trick. I have to say that one of the things that I often think to myself is, if you talk about who the most disastrous politicians of a particular decade or a particular time are, it is very difficult actually to come away without the feeling that David Cameron and, from opposition, Ed Miliband are pretty close to the top of the pile, actually, for one reason or another. One of those will be a popular thing to say here, one of them may be slightly more kind of controversial. But again, if you look at the seeds being sown, and of course no one individual is entirely to blame for any of this, but being in leading positions to try and work out what's likely to happen. Anyway, in 2011 I'd written a piece at the time saying we're sleep arguing our way out of Europe. One of the things I was never optimistic about was about the future of a referendum, because it just didn't seem to be any politician's business or any large group's business to say to people from the outset, this is a worthwhile enterprise. It's been the centre of British geopolitical and strategic approach since the early 60s, and the penalty you will pay if you do something else will be pretty catastrophic, albeit on a slow burn catastrophe, and so on. So in that sense, if that's what I said in 2013, whether you talked about it at all, I do not know. In that sense, I think I can say I got things right. There are all kinds of things that you couldn't possibly predict. You couldn't, I don't think, predict Donald Trump. You couldn't think that you would go from Barack Obama, who won a Nobel Prize just by being elected president, practically, and kind of given it almost the day afterwards, as a sort of huge expression of relief on the part of the committee that was awarding the prize, Nobel Peace Prize, that you would go straight from that to Donald Trump. It didn't seem conceivable. I mean, it didn't even seem conceivable to people who were in America, being expert about America, to us, sitting there in 2013. If any of us, I don't know, I don't think anybody put their hand up saying, are you at all worried about, say, a bonkers businessman and obvious fantasist becoming president of America? I don't think I would sign up for that. Would I have predicted a full-scale European war? Not in 2013. In 2014 I might have done, when Putin annexed Crimea. But even then, right the way up until the October of 2021, when the administration of Joe Biden started predicting that there were huge Russian troop movements, etc., which would look predicated, an invasion preceded a possible invasion of Ukraine. If you remember, a lot of people didn't believe that at the time, didn't want to, etc. I wouldn't have guessed, and nor did the experts, that Putin would do something so fundamentally risky for his own country and for everybody else. But it's there in the character. When you look back, you can see, as with so many authoritarians, that as they run into significant problems, or as they run to a notion of what it is their legacy should be, because populist solutions tend not to work, and you have to then begin to try and double down on the various things that you suggest and things that you want to and the things that you want to do, the authoritarian streak intensifies. It doesn't get less. It doesn't get negotiated away. By and large, it's going to get worse, and the character, which is implicit, becomes explicit. It's not true to say that people don't change, and we all know people, and we all know in ourselves things that we have changed about ourselves and so on. But it is fundamentally true, I think, of an authoritarian personality and an intolerant personality. That put in power, the tendency will, not absolutely inevitably, but is very likely to be a trajectory towards greater authoritarianism and to greater danger. And if anybody doesn't believe that, they just have to kind of try and contemplate the possibility of a second Trump election next November. I can't say enough how much this terrifies me, and this world is already terrifying enough as it is. I mean, just to see that last night, the Republican majority in the House of Representatives not only elected as Speaker somebody who thinks that homosexuality is a threat to Western democracy, but Vladimir Putin isn't, but also somebody who, along with Trump, tried to overturn the results of a democratic election. When in democracies, significant political figures don't accept the results of a vote, then you are in huge trouble. It's just the whole fundamental basis upon which you choose to do things is undermined. Not unlike in somewhere like Hungary, where if you undermine the independence of the judiciary and of all the media completely, then in that case, essentially you begin to lose contact with the essential parts of your democracy. And of course, you could not predict COVID. However, when I say you couldn't predict COVID, all I mean by that is you couldn't predict the exact form that the next pandemic would take. You couldn't predict whether it would be a respiratory virus or whether it would be a flu virus. You couldn't predict whether or not it would affect this section of the population more than that section of the population, depending upon its properties. But the one thing that you knew, as we know with climate change, and we do know with climate change, is that it would happen. Because microbiology tells you that it will happen all the time, constantly. Bacteria and viruses evolve, mutate, and find ways into hosts so they can duplicate. Sooner or later, you will have one. So the question was how prepared you are going to be for it. And the same question is rising now with regard to the resilience you'll need to deal with the amount of climate change which has already happened and which will already happen no matter what you do. And I have to say, I mean, being a grandfather does kind of put this into a slight kind of, into a certain degree of focus. I do look at my granddaughter and I think, what have you done? I mean, if you walk down the high street near us, and there are all these cars, most of them still not electric, still kind of chugging stuff into the atmosphere, and you do think, why is even one part of this happening, adding to what we've already got? And I mean, of course, Britain is a small country, or a smallish country, in the kind of great scheme of things, etc. But we already have 1.3 degrees of warming since the industrial age. We are certainly on course for 1.6. Most scientists, climate scientists that I can look at, think we are likely to hit 2 degrees. What we're having now, the additional extreme weather events, are at 1.3. Okay, so you can work it out for yourself. Even if you did nothing else, you would have to try and build in anti-flood resilience, anti-fire resilience, etc., into our systems. And do you think we are doing that? Is that something that you think that we are adequately preparing for? This responsibility, in a sense, you could ask, that generationally we have? I wonder, and it makes me feel, I have to say, it makes me feel a bit desperate when I think about it. But desperation is not terribly useful. But the point about making a point about COVID is it's in the nature of viruses and bacteria to mutate. It's in the nature of authoritarians and extremists to try and destroy democracy, of terrorists to destroy thought, and of ideologues to ignore the complexities of life in order to try and get to where they need to go. I've just reviewed for the Financial Times this week a book by a very good political scientist called Yasha Nunn on what he calls the identity trap, which identifies not just, because he's written 2 previous books about the problem of right populism, now also about some of the mistakes made on the left, such as the notion that we should treat people now increasingly according to what group they identify with, that this becomes the key kind of marker. And if you're not of that group, then in that case you relinquish any right to have a feeling or a thought or an expression about it. One of the examples that he gives of how mistaken this can be, you would think from the best of motives, was during the course of the early vaccination program in the United States, the vaccination authorities and the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, had to have a discussion about priority for vaccines. And what they were doing was awarding points on the basis of certain kind of characteristics so that they could come to a decision about what priority should be. Under all circumstances, with COVID-19, the priority had to be elderly groups. It just had to be, because they were the people who are significantly at more risk. It made no sense for it to be anything else. But some of the people in the CDC looking at this were worried that because the elderly in the States were skewed towards being white, that this was somehow unfair. So they constructed a system whereby actually they would give extra points to what they called emergency workers, which is a very broad category in the States, because they were more ethnically diverse. So the first proposition that went up for vaccination was they should go to emergency workers first and the elderly group second. Meaning paradoxically that more people, ethnic minority people, would die as a consequence of that decision, despite them being a smaller part of the elderly group because of the way in which the virus worked. And what Malk said was, we don't only kind of face problems from the right towards liberal universalism, but there are also challenges off to the progressive, to parts of the progressive left. And when I look at, for example, some young people whose knowledge of the situation I would not say was intricate, immediately saying that what the Gaza situation is an issue of and Israel is an issue of decolonisation because they have learned it from somebody, etc. You begin to understand some of the challenges that liberal universalism, for all its faults, actually has to undergo. So this is the last part, almost exactly on the 40 minutes I see, which you just because I think we're going to do some questions and answers, aren't we? That's right. This is a plea, really, for us to recall, particularly our generation, and try and spread it on, the values of what you call liberal universalism. They're all there in Martin Luther King's famous speech about the content of people's character, not the colour of their skin, nor any other, actually, not significant facts about them, biologically or in a kind of other way, that we have more in common with each other than divides us. That Muslim families want to live in the same kind of way and raise their grandchildren in the same way as Jewish families, in the same way as Christian families, in the same way as families who have absolutely no religious faith whatsoever. That we must, in a sense, rediscover and re-put our own kind of articles of faith, even if they're liberal articles of faith, which therefore mean because they're liberal articles of faith, we won't kill people for them on the whole, and so on. And we won't, I mean, in a way, liberal values are quite difficult to maintain in the age of social media, because it seems quite often that it's all about shouting and being shouted at. Who's got the loudest, who gets there the fastest, who seizes the agenda and so on. I'm not saying that we're immensely powerful here. I mean, one of the things is we're old, aren't we? I mean, excuse, please, those few people who managed to creep in who are not yet 65. I think it should have been banned, frankly. It's just not bad anyway. We have enough to do with our grandchildren, let alone mixing with younger people. This is just a plea at the end of this 10 years. I think if I want to distill what I think I've learned in that 10 years since, it is the necessity of upholding, with as best arguments as you can and wherever you can, those values which we had taken for granted coming into the 60s, 70s and 80s and argued for, and need to be, I think, re-argued for. And that's as much as I want to say.
Well, as a survey over the last 10 years, I think that gives an opportunity to ask questions on almost anything. So please, who would like to raise an issue?
Just wondering if you've got any thoughts about mine.
I think a mic will be coming to you. One of it's not just my sight, which is not so good.
Yes, sorry, thank you. It was lovely to hear that, David. Very interesting review. Just wondering if you've got any thoughts about what life might be like in 10 years' time. Sorry about that.
Well, as I said, because, let's face it, each 10-year segment, there's a slightly greater chance that you'll not make it through to the next 10 years. So I think it's all a question, it's also an actuarial question, how lucky do I feel? I can't get there, I cannot separate my hopes for what we can do and what we can avoid from my desire to give predictions about them. I mean, we just talked about, I was just talking about Donald Trump being re-elected. If Donald Trump is re-elected, I have absolutely no idea how much American democracy there will be left after 4 years. I honestly can't tell you. I can tell you that it would be a huge victory for Vladimir Putin because it's likely to have significant effects on support for Ukraine, which would then have to be done almost entirely from Europe, which places a kind of burden which then becomes the subject of attack from European populists in some countries. I can get you as far as next year with the prediction that Labour will win the next election. I think I can do that for you, but 20 points up, and despite absolutely kind of continuous little barrage of pro-conservative commentators or people who just want to hedge their bet saying, is this the way Rishi Sunak can find his way back to number 10? This looks to me like a done deal. People have had enough of them. People have had enough of them, not just in places like this where, frankly, the support for the Conservative Party was never likely to be at its kind of peak. It's quite clear that people in other places with other backgrounds and so on feel very much the same way. So that's clear. Will we? But it's also clear that a Labour government will inherit an economic situation very, very different from the one in which the Blair government inherited in 1997. Far more difficult, huge, loads of demands upon it, and a real need, however, to try and deal with some of the long-term problems. So let's take a kind of long-term problem. I'm not taking too long to answer your question, I'm sorry, William, but let's take a question about a long-term problem. One of the problems we have with the National Health Service is it's hospital loaded. We were listening today, just today, to how people like district nurses have been exempted from one of the bonus payments coming out. And you think, this is madness. You build your public health system from the community outwards. So it starts with people's health and the capacity to get people low level of treatments before they become ill and chronically ill and so on. And yet all our stuff is about waiting lists once you get into hospitals and so on. No, get it earlier. Build up your public health system, build up your district nurse network, build up your drugs rehabilitation or drugs treatment network so people don't find that A&E becomes the catch-all for every and each problem which you suffer in society because you haven't done the little bits of work. One of the things about austerity, which we were 3 years into in 2013, was we haven't yet begun to feel the attrition that it would lead to in some of the absolutely critical services, which were unpopular services. They weren't the ones that people want to talk about. People only ever want to talk about hospitals. And so on. Yet most of our health treatment happens outside hospital setting, but it seems most chronic there. So I'm sorry, that gives you a kind of idea of one of the things that you feel the government, a new Labour government has to tackle, but the benefit of it isn't seen for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years down the road. So that will be something. So my prediction is I can only give you that one. I mean, I think and hope that European capitalism will be defeated, but I can't be sure about that. I can't, if you look at France, which is a sort of country which does quite well, but which is determined to think it does badly, etc. I can't be sure that Marine Le Pen or some won't be the next president instead. I can only hope. Anyway, that's enough of that.
One here, and then one at the back, and then one over there.
When we were, this generation, were school children, half the world was covered in red paint, red ink on the maps. Now, there's a lot of talk about Britain's global reach, but the governments emasculate the BBC, which is one of our, which used to be at least one of our glories, and our aircraft carriers don't work and have to go back into dock. And we send Richie around to try and do something about the situation in the Middle East, but I mean, what does he do? He's got no influence of any kind. Now, my question is this going to continue to, and Brexit, of course, has completely humiliated us, is this going to continue to a downward spiral?
Yeah, I mean, we could go back to Harold Macmillan almost in 1961 to 63. Harold Macmillan says there isn't really a big future for British influence outside of Europe, because a series of middle-sized powers essentially had to cooperate in order to make their presence felt. Britain had, because of its history, it had good diplomats. But then on the whole, it had a good, you learn this gradually, it has a good reputation for diplomacy. Because of the linguistic power of English as a language, it has quite a lot of cultural influence around the place. The BBC also, and the reputation of the BBC and the Royal Service and so on. And those things could still be pressed back into play a bit, and so on. Because it's very difficult to see how we could get closer to the EU again, and I'm absolutely certain that will be part of what the Starmer government wants to do. But the business of getting back in is a hell of a business. It really is. I mean, I'm as avid a rejoiner as anybody on this planet, but the difficulties of getting back in, I think the European Union would accept us back in, but I don't know on what terms exactly. I think culturally we could be fairly strong, as I said, because of the kind of linguistic question, but we have taken terrific damage. And the other thing is that there is a delusion, and you saw it there in the David Cameron speech. It is, and I don't want to be, honestly, I don't want to be classist about this, but Rishi Sunak was head boy at Winchester, effortlessly. You can see this kind of effortlessness with which it all happens. This is not that world. It's not that world. This is a world of hard work and graft, and learning the hard way, etc. So, mind you, Liz Truss didn't go to a public school, and she wasn't exactly. Maybe I should can it a bit on that side. We could build things up again. I think we could if we do the right things. A bit.
This lady in the back? Oh, there's one over here. You have your hand up. Or the one further up. Yep.
It's a very unrewarding job being able to take the microphone.
I'm here. You've covered lots of topics, but you haven't covered this world migration. And I wondered whether there are any ideas you had of possibly encouraging people to stay where they are rather than moving, because it is becoming such a huge problem.
Okay. I'm going to ask you a question. Do you think that the biggest problem we have demographically over the long term is overpopulation? Or do you think it's ageing population? If you're forced to choose. I can see you.
Probably overpopulation.
Yeah, wrong. So, and that may be part of the answer to your question, but it's only a little bit of the part. Right. First, big picture. Virtually every single Western country, bar one, I think, and that might be Israel, has well below replacement rate fertility. Now, what this means is that we aren't churning babies out at anything like the rate at which you would need to replace the population. But your population at the same time has been, up until now, and with any luck we'll continue on a trend soon again, has been ageing. So here's the question for you: who's going to look after all those old people? Who's going to pay the taxes in order to keep them going if they're not working? Well, one answer is that we're all going to have to work much longer, and we're going to have to find ways of doing that and making that work for ourselves. I noticed that one of the things about iU3A is that you mustn't be working full time. That's what it says at the top. Well, actually, there's a big argument that half of you ought to be working at least 2/3 time or something like that. It wasn't with the grandchildren, right? I mean, maybe their parents can look after them occasionally. No, don't record that. So we face a huge demographic problem. Now, of course, for the medium term, there are lots of countries where they do have above replacement rate, particularly in Africa. On a purely kind of actuarial basis, it would make a lot of sense to encourage migration by younger people into this country, because they can't be looked after actually where they are. They can't find jobs, and if we said to ourselves, our task is to encourage people to come here and to properly integrate them, and that's the job we're going to set about doing, rather than regarding it all the time as some kind of negative that we have to manage. Then, I know. My grandparents came here as illiterate Jews from Lithuania, much despised at the time as not having much of a contribution, etc. Totally unskilled, so they're unskilled. I tend to think that over the generations we've begun to pay back a little bit, and so on. So you can't kind of know. Insofar as you're talking about a different problem, which is how you manage migration when you get it, well, my answer to that is to try and take a longer term view and say, let's try and make it work, instead of always complaining about it, and so on. Let's try and make